Hello, listeners. Yamina here. Welcome to the Dr. GPCR podcast. Today's episode is a very special one and for many reasons. This episode marks a significant milestone for us here at Dr. GPCR, as it is the 100th episode of our podcast. We hosted an entire panel of guests to celebrate Dr. Mark Caron, a giant and visionary in the GPCR field and beyond. In this episode, we talked to a panel of 9 guests, including not one, but 2 Nobel laureates, all who worked with Dr. Caron in some shape or form between the early 1970s and late 1980s. Last but not least, I also had the honor of working with Dr. Kathleen Caron, the daughter of Mark Caron, who is also my co-host in this episode. Before we dive into this 100th episode of the Dr. GPCR podcast, we are thrilled to announce that our ecosystem is expanding and are delighted to count Domain Therapeutics, GPCR Therapeutics, Design Pharmaceuticals, Montana Molecular, and Orion Biotechnology as our ecosystem partners in 2023. Become an ecosystem member yourself and join our partners and your colleagues today. The ecosystem is your GPCR-focused virtual playground. Join over 700 of your peers who have already started exploring, connecting, and collaborating better. You can explore the ecosystem by signing up and getting a free site membership. When you are ready, you can also get a premium membership to unlock the ecosystem's full benefits. If you'd like to register your team or your company, or if you live in a developing country, please reach out to us by email at hello@drgpcr.com and we'll help you join us. The list of benefits of the ecosystem is quite long. Today, we want to take a moment and highlight that as a premium member, you can get in touch directly with your peers via chat, discuss GPCRs in the forum, and even ask topic-specific questions in dedicated groups that you too can create. Are you looking for your next career opportunity? Our job board is a GPCR-focused one, where you can explore different opportunities. And if you're looking to hire, you can submit your own job description. Wondering what meeting to go to next? Well, check out the event page where we have curated the next GPCR meetings for you. In case you're organizing a meeting, fill out the event submission form and advertise your event in the ecosystem. Take advantage of everything that the GPCR dedicated online playground has to offer today. Explore the possibilities by navigating the site using the direct links in the footer. Check it out today at drgpcr.com/ecosystem. And now let's dive into this very special episode. Hello, everyone. Yamina here. We are recording today episode 100 of the Dr. GPCR podcast. And today I have with me many guests, which is unusual, but we are here to remember Dr. Mark Caron. And today I have with me as a co-host, Dr. Kathleen Caron. I'm excited to have you on board. So Kathleen, why don't we start with you as an introduction and then we can go around the virtual room we're in today.
Great. Thank you so much, Yamina, and thank you for this wonderful assembly of colleagues and friends and family, frankly. I'm Kathleen Caron, Mark Caron's eldest daughter, also representing our family, my sister Melissa and my brother Nelson. And we're here today to have some conversations and celebrations about Mark and his contributions to our discipline. And I am currently a scientist, for those of you who don't know, and I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Cell Biology and Physiology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is a large basic science department. We're all going to go through and introduce ourselves very briefly and mention when we first met Mark. I met him on July 17th, 1970, when I was born, and shortly thereafter met many of you. And so I have had the pleasure and honor of knowing most of you almost my entire life. So it's really wonderful to have you here. So let's go around my screen. I'll just pick, and then after you introduce yourself, you pick the next person. And so Jeff Benovic is the first on my screen. Jeff.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Benovic. I'm a professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology at Thomas Jefferson University. And I first met Mark when I did a rotation. I did my PhD at Duke University in the biochemistry program and did a rotation in the fall of 1981. in Bob's lab and met Mark during that rotation. And he really guided me through a lot of the work during my rotation, but then for the next 8-year period when I joined Bob's lab. So I'll talk more about that later. Frederick?
Okay. Yes, my name is Frederick Lee Blundberg, and I'm a professor in the Department of Experimental Medical Science in the Faculty of Medicine at Lund University in Lund, Sweden. So, and I've been here since 2002, and before that I was a professor in Texas at the UT Health Science Center in San Antonio. So I met Mark the first time when I came over for an interview. I think it was in May of 1982, and then of course I was allowed to come back in August and continue my postdoctoral work there with Bob and Mark, and I worked closely with Mark for all the 4 years that I was at Duke. So I think, David, do you want to go?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Sibley. I'm a senior investigator at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders of Stroke at NIH. I vividly remember meeting Mark when I was a graduate student at UC San Diego in the spring of 1979. Mark was presenting a poster at the Endocrine Society meeting that was in Anaheim, California. The topic was dopamine receptor binding in the anterior pituitary gland, which happened to be the topic that I was just beginning to work on as a graduate student. So my advisor, Ian Crease, and I thought we would drive up to Anaheim for the day to check out Mark's poster, which we did, had a very interesting discussion. It actually was kind of funny because we were seeing GTP sensitivity of agonist binding to the D2 receptor in the pituitary gland. We didn't know what that meant because the D2 receptor wasn't supposed to be linked to adenylyl cyclase. But anyway, we had actually went out to lunch with Mark and had a really good discussion, very friendly meeting. And later on, I met Mark again at a catecholamine Gordon conference and asked him whether or not it might be advisable to write to Bob to see if I would be acceptable as a postdoc in the laboratory. And Mark encouraged me to do that. And I did that a year later. And as we say, the rest is history. So, Michelle.
Thanks, David. So, hi, everyone. I am Michel Bouvier. I am a professor of biochemistry and molecular medicine at the University of Montreal and the general director of the Institute for Research in Immunology and Cancer at the same university. And I first met Mark when I came to interview with Bob for a postdoctoral position. Bob told me, there's someone here which would like to meet you. As a French Canadian, I guess there was already some close links that we could make one with another. So it immediately was, I would say, love at first sight. It was a great meeting with Mark. And then when I came with my trailer in the back of my car, moving from Canada, who was in the parking lot of the Holly Hills apartment to introduce me to my apartment that he had rented for me was Mark. So, and from then on, we had an incredible good relationship during my stay in Bob's lab. I have fun memory of the meetings in Bob's office, brainstorming about all kinds of things. And then when I returned to Canada, it was, of course, very helpful in many instances. And we kept a very close friendship throughout the years. So let's go with the next one, Rick Cerione.
Hi, I'm Rick Cerione, aka Rocco. I am a professor in chemistry and chemical biology at Cornell, and I first met Mark in 1982 when I came to interview for a postdoc with Bob. And, Bob was telling me that Duke was going to be great in basketball again. And Mark told me he could get me season tickets to Cameron, which he did. And so that sold the deal. And then this, everyone says the rest is history. Oh, sorry. Who's Bob?
Yeah, so my name's Bob Lefkowitz, and I'm a professor of medicine and biochemistry at Duke, also an investigator of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. I guess Kathleen's the only one on the call who's known Mark longer than myself. Mark joined my lab in the summer, I'm going to guess August, I might be off plus or minus a few weeks, August of 1973. And he had in common with several other people on the call, at least Brian and looking around Lee. These were all postdocs in my lab who, to the best of my recollection, I never met face to face before the day that they actually walked into my lab to work. And each one of those is a story which we may or may not get to later on. And that's basically my story. Let's see, who hasn't spoken yet? I guess Lee, Brian, either one.
Go, Brian.
So, yes, I was a cardiologist. So I'm Brian Kabelka. I'm a professor of molecular and cellular physiology at Stanford University. I met Mark in 1984, I believe it was in February. I was a resident in internal medicine looking to become a cardiology fellow at Duke. And I was particularly interested in Duke because it had a research option. And so I was interviewing potential labs in 1984. And I went around to a number of labs, and I was warned against the Lefkowitz lab. It was just too big, and I'd get lost, and I'd never see Bob. But I interviewed anyway, not with Bob, who wasn't there, but with Mark Caron. And it was just a great experience. I really felt that even though I would be the least experienced person in the lab, that I would have at least Mark's attention. And I subsequently came back for a revisit. Bob wasn't there again, but I visited it with Mark again, and that sort of sealed my decision to join the Lefkowitz lab.
Thank you, Brian. Lee, you're next. It
might be my turn. So my name's Lee Limburn, and after retiring as a faculty member at Vanderbilt, I find myself at a small liberal arts, historically Black college, Fisk University in Nashville. And I met Mark in the summer of 1973. I think Bob's right, it was August, because Mark was wise and came after all the boxes had been opened. I was Bob's first postdoc. So anyway, so for me, my experience with Mark, and we'll share more later, is sort of an extended family member because my PhD work had been highly clinical. And so even though my degree's in biochemistry, frankly, I learned many of the fundamentals from biochemistry from Mark. But more than that, we had caboodles of fun.
Thank you, everyone, for those kind words and those introductions. And I was listening to the years when you met Mark and when you each were in that area, and I was thinking, I was not born, or I was maybe 3 years old. And I'm so excited that we get to talk about this. So let's go around the room again. And you've all told us when you first met Mark, and you've known him for a very long period. And as Bob mentioned, Kathleen, you're the most experienced there. I want us to talk a little bit about what do you think, in your opinion, or how do you think Mark influenced the GPCR field? So Kathleen, I'm gonna let you go first, and then we can go do the same thing and pick the next person.
Oh, thanks. Well, that's a really lofty question.
It is
possible to put to sum up, but to me, this is how he influenced the field. It's all of these people. You can talk about the single discoveries and the dopamine receptors or beta arrestin or these things are discoveries and they're science, but really it's the community and it's the scholars and this family of people that have been built that really create an entire discipline. And just keeping that, we have 3 podcasts coming because there's epochs of people. It's really remarkable to see the expansion of lives that are touched, and this just continuously effusive, positive enthusiasm to pursue science, with your whole heart, and just that's something that I think my father taught many of us. And it's just so every corner of the world has trainees from Lefkowitz and Caron lab that have been touched and motivated and continue to be by that inspiration. So to me, it's not a single paper or a single molecule or a single drug. It's really building this community of people.
Thank you, Kathleen. Before we go around, I just wanted to mention that I think that's such a great answer, and just to to attest to that impact. So you mentioned 3 podcasts. With your help, Kathleen, we came up with a list of 30 people, and out of those 30 people, everyone agreed to come and join us for these 3 episodes, and I think that says a lot. For that impact. Bob, I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, so to me, Mark impacted several fields at several different stages of his career. But to me, perhaps the most important one was during the first 10 years when we worked very closely together. At that time, there was no such thing as a biochemical approach to studying drug and hormone receptors. It was not a biochemical field of study. It was a field for the physiologist. And so here you had Mark, freshly minted PhD, and me knowing relatively little about biochemistry. And we sort of cooked up this plan to try to identify receptors and study them biochemically, for which there was no precedent. I think our relative youth, and I would point out that Mark was only 3 years younger than me. When he joined the lab, I was 30 and he was 27. Today, I have very few postdocs who are that young. So we were kind of fearless. And I remember vividly attending a meeting in 1974. I could have been in Vancouver. It was in Canada, in the Pacific Northwest. It was the International Cyclic AMP meeting. And we had just developed the alprenolol binding assays. And I remember we were really very high on the whole thing. Lee was at that meeting. Rusty Williams came as well, and Mark. I think those were the 3 people from my lab, and that was a good part of the lab. There weren't many other people in the lab at that time. And I remember sitting together, the 4 of us, on a bed in my room or one of the rooms, and just sketching plans. And we talked about our excitement about thinking that now that we had a ligand binding approach, we could actually go after it. And we sketched a vision together for about the next 10 years of work. How we would solubilize the receptors, somehow purify them, God knows how, and maybe figure out how to reconstitute them, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't look much beyond that in 1974. But to me, that was one of the most important ways in which Mark influenced everything that came thereafter. Namely, that you could study membrane proteins like receptors as if they were biochemical entities. And that was completely new. That had never been done before.
Bob. Lee, how do you remember this meeting?
How do I remember it?
Yes.
I don't know if I remember that conversation or think tank at the same time, but I do remember that this was during the window of time where even back at Duke, the chair of physiology at that time, didn't believe receptors were molecules.
It's true.
He would have conversations with you like, why are you spending your life on that? Because it's a mood. The drug interacts with the hormone interacts with the cell, and then it just changes its mood.
You're
so or something,
like that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Lee. No, I just, because I had a similar experience, and it was in 1982 or 3. I mean, even all those years later, Bob and I were in Italy at some meeting, and Bob, he was so enthusiastic about, we were gonna, do the greatest science ever, and all these British scientists get up and say there's no receptors, and I was supposed to be like reconstituting a receptor, and now I'm starting to panic. And when I got back to Duke, I see Mark, and I said, Mark, these guys don't believe in receptors. And he goes, Rocco, you're an Italian. I'm a French Canadian. Are we going to listen to a bunch of boring Brits? We push forward.
Anyone else wants to chime in?
Just like to echo. Go ahead, Scoop. No, go ahead, Scoop. Go ahead.
I'll say a little bit. So, I mean, what Bob said about the discoveries that Mark really made in the 70s when he was initially a trainee and then left and came back as a junior faculty member, those really, from my perspective, they helped to drive the field because it was focusing on one primary receptor, the beta adrenergic receptor, and it set the stage for everything, or at least a majority of the research that was going on in the lab, in Bob and Mark's lab, in the 80s. Okay, and it certainly influenced everything I did during that period. So, and I think that receptor, I mean, rhodopsin, the other one, but the beta receptor really was the model, and it ended up driving ultimately the cloning of GPCRs, the really understanding the mechanisms that regulate GPCRs, and Mark really played a central role in every aspect of that. In the way, at least during the 80s, when it was really run as a joint lab. Mark had his own group on dopamine receptors, but it was a small group. But Bob and Mark really worked together seamlessly, overseeing everything that was going on in that laboratory. And obviously, a lot of good people there, but really an incredible amount of science. So I think that drove the field. Obviously, Mark made major impacts on monoamine transporters and dopamine receptors and many other things. But that really started the field from my perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say that was one of the reasons why I, wanted to come to Bob's lab was, the purification techniques, especially the affinity chromatography approaches, really was what drove the field at the time, as you've all said. But I remember a paper. I think it was Robbie Shore was the first author in JBC. It was purification of the frog erythrocyte beta receptor in 1981 or something like that, which was a phenomenal piece of biochemistry. And I thought that, this is where I want to do a postdoc. And of course, when I got there, Jeff was working on the mammalian purification work. So, really phenomenal.
So I'd just like to echo some of what Kathleen has said to begin with, and I'll come back to some of the science after, but I think the impact that Mark had on the community is tremendous. Not only the one that he touched directly because he was working with them in the lab or become collaborator later, but in meetings, what always struck me from Mark in meetings is he was asking very good questions, but not only was he asking very good questions which were insightful, was doing it always in a way that made the person who was giving the talk or presenting the poster look good. So the intention behind the question was not only getting the answer, of course it was, but it was also to encourage the person to continue his endeavor in science, and also make realize to everybody in the room that the contribution that this person had just made was important for the field in general. So I thought this was always very striking to me. And the other thing I'd like to say, which is also, I think, quite unique to Mark, is that Mark not only had influenced his own research program, but I'm sure Bob would agree, he had a major influence on Bob's research program simultaneously. So these two things, of course, started in Bob's lab, but then, you know, he maintained the very close relationship with Bob's lab and having his own research activities. And that was mentioned on the transporters, the dopamine receptors. And there's not that many examples of people that can do these two things at the same time in a very generous manner. And finally, the last thing which struck me and where he influenced the field, I think, is the very close tie he was able to make between concept, questions, and methods, and covering the entire thing, going from biochemistry, then to molecular biology, then to cell biology, then to physiology, but paying attention to the methods. And just as an anecdote, I mean, everybody I think would agree with that. No offense, Bob, but when we had a technical question, we would go to Mark.
Sure. No offense taken.
Thank you, Michel. And just want to point out, you know, that you mentioned being able to ask questions and make the person feel comfortable and really get the answer, but also encourage them. Now I know where you learned that from, because I always thought of you as the person who can sit there throughout 8 hours of presentations of trainees and ask at every talk a question and make that trainee feel good. So now I know Mark is behind your ability to ask those questions. Thank you for that. Anyone else wants to chime in as to how do you think Mark influenced? Please.
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, you know, I agree with what everyone has said here, but so I did my PhD studies not on GPCRs, but on the GABA receptor ion channel complex, and we'd done a lot of radioligand binding studies and discovered many interesting drug interactions with this. But I felt like I really wanted to know what was receiving that ligand, what was the protein, and of course that's why I wanted to go to Bob and Mark's lab, and even though it was Bob who contacted me first, I remember the first contact I had with you, Bob. You called the lab, and Richard Olson, my PhD supervisor, said, "This is Bob Lefkowitz on the telephone. What does he want with you?" and I said, "Oh my God!" And so anyway, so it was it was a very friendly introduction to your group, because you said, "Hi, Fred," and anyway, that was before I met Mark. But then I joined the group, and there are many things that I think we're going to talk about later. That's in segment 2 and 3 here. But I do want to say that Mark, he's an experimentalist. He's very good experimentalist. He really knew how to get the experiments to work. And that is very, very important. And I think and we've all learned from Mark how to do experiments. And I think that's why we've become pretty good scientists and successful in working with this very difficult family of proteins. They're not easy to work with. There are very few people that really know how to work with these receptors. So I think that is a very important part. And of course, I worked on the alpha-1 adrenergic receptor and purified it and learned a lot of things from Mark. So I think, again, reiterating what many of you have said, it is really how to isolate and then subsequently be able to clone these receptors that Mark has contributed significantly to in this field.
So just to expand on that, this concept of being a good experimentalist, something I don't know who coined it. I often use the term, but I don't know where it comes from. EQ, experimental quotient. All of you know that you learn very quickly when somebody comes to work with you, whether they have a high or a low EQ, by which I mean just what you were referring to, just a raw ability to make experiments work. And, we sometimes say, well, does he or she have good hands? Which, of course, completely misplaces the emphasis. The hands are controlled by the head. And being a terrific experimentalist is not a matter of, how good your hands are. But Mark had a very, very high EQ and an amazing ability to translate a question into just the right experiment, which is another whole art unto itself. The other thing I just want to point out about Mark that was such an important thing on the impact he had on all of us was something he shared with me, which was the power of belief. From the beginning, neither he nor I ever really seriously doubted that we would succeed in all the major goals that we took on one by one. I think the only moment of doubt that I had in my whole career was later on during the cloning phase, when I think for the first time Brian pulled that out of the fire. But other than that, no matter what we encountered, Mark and I always believed it was just a matter of time. It wasn't a matter of whether we would get a radioligand. It was just when. It wasn't a matter of whether we could solubilize it, just a matter of when. It wasn't a matter of whether we could develop an affinity. At every stage of the game, he was totally in, as was I, in terms of that belief. And I think that belief is something he would transmit to others. And again, I think when my belief would waver, he'd get me going, and vice versa. And I think all of us, shared that sense of ultimate optimism, even when things look bleak, day to day, week to week, even month to month, or in some cases, year to year.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Bob. Brian, you had please feel free to interrupt each other. It's really as interactive as you want it to be. Lee, you raise your hand first, and Brian, you 1 second.
So I was going to follow up, on all comments really, but Michel Bouvier's specifically. One of the things that made working in Bob's lab so wonderful early on is that the field was highly competitive. There were people like Levitsky in Israel who found joy in trying to suppress everyone else and find the fault in their experiment instead of the strength. And then there's a crowd at the NIH who had similar joys. But Mark was always in the lab and in that microenvironment, non-competitive in a highly competitive field. That was, it didn't matter that we weren't doing the same experiments. He was my cheerleader. I think sometimes I was his cheerleader. And he was always supremely helpful. So I don't know if you can see this little sucker. So I still keep this on my desk. This is a cut off 12 by 75 plastic tube with a wire wrapped around it and masking tape that Mark made for me because scooping out 1 gram of alumina for each of 100 cyclase columns, he thought could be automated at least a bit. And so I just keep that treasure to remind me of the sheer joy of working with Mark. We had some funny 2 a.m. cold room stories too, and maybe we'll get a chance to get to 1 or 2, but I doubt it. But I think that his ability to find the positive which lifted you up and made you keep banging your head against that proverbial brick wall was really unique.
Definitely want to hear about those 2 a.m. Cold room stories. Brian, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, when I came into the lab, I was, very inexperienced. Ultimately, became part of the cloning team, and the lab had no expertise in cloning at the time. And I made a few trips to Merck to learn basics. But when I came back, Bob gave me the go ahead to try to set up the cloning lab, and we made so many sort of stupid mistakes in our effort. And I would, after every failed experiment, would go to Mark, and even though he wasn't a trained molecular biologist, he always seemed to be able to come up with the right approach to the next experiment. And what I think I really learned from Mark then and subsequently was how to troubleshoot. Invariably experiments will go wrong, but if you don't understand why they went wrong, then they were a complete waste of time. And I just remember, always getting good counsel from Mark in terms of, planning experiments that he, really wasn't necessarily an expert in, but he knew how to solve problems. And I thought that was a particularly important trait as an experimentalist.
Another thing that relates to that was characteristic of Mark was his adventurousness and what I call technical courage. What Brian says is true. The lab had never done molecular biology before. But the fact of the matter is we had never done anything that we did before. I mean, none of us had ever done any of it. Mark had never done any of that. I mean, we'd never purified a receptor, developed a radioligand, developed definitive chromatography, none of it. And then came the cloning, which was sort of the next thing that none of us knew how to do. But with people like Mark, Brian, and the rest of the group here, somehow you figured it out.
Thank you, Bob. Anyone else? Please, Fred.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing, another thing, and I don't know what segment it falls into, but
the segments. I'm sorry. Just want to mention the segments are not important. This was just to give you an idea. So any anecdotes you have, anything you feel like talking about, any 2 a.m. cold room stories, please feel free. Don't inhibit yourselves.
Anyway, I just wanted to mention, of course, we were also iodinating the radioligands that we were working with. I worked with heat. So we were making I-125 heat, and we were in there. And then Mark came in, and he started to iodinate also. And I said, Mark, why are you in here? You're not, you're sort of the supervisor here. No, I have to do this because I have to justify my name on the paper.
He was a true player coach.
Really.
Well, I just want to, I'm going to have to leave at some point, as I mentioned earlier. So, but one thing I wanted to emphasize, because I can't remember what the segments are, but, Mark was not only really a great scientist, but he had a great heart. He was so decent, and so when I was, and I don't know if Kathleen remembers this, when I was in the lab, I was single, I didn't have a family, and Mark used to worry about my nutritional status.
And my mother too. My mother was you were very thin.
Yeah. Well, and I wasn't much of a cook. So Mark would have me over to have dinner with the family, and be Pauline and Kathleen, Melissa, and Nelson. But, Pauline always had vegetables. And I wasn't much of a vegetable eater, and it was always broccoli. And I really didn't like broccoli, So, I had a few dinners, and then, Mark would say, "Well, you want to come over for dinner tonight?" And I'd say, "I don't know." I'd come up with some excuse, and he goes, "Rocco, why don't you want to come for dinner?" I said, "Well, I really, I don't like vegetables that much." He goes, "Okay, we'll solve this. I'll give you a nudge. Sit next to me, and we'll take care of it. So I went to dinner again, and Mark kind of pokes me. And when Pauline wasn't looking, I'd throw some of the broccoli on Mark's plate. Mark would eat my broccoli for me because Pauline was determined that I would set a good example for the kids, and I was the worst example setter you can imagine. So.
Funny. Good story.
So I think looking at some of the other prompts, one of the ones that I think would be great is to throw out some adjectives, and that's related to sort of the top three qualities and that you could think of. And I'll share some, so Dad was a great dad, right? But I'll share with you some things that kind of transgress between his family life and his work life. In my three things, the work ethic, and many of you have spoken about this. 2 a.m. was the norm, so it was routine in our family life that Dad would come back home around 5:30. My mother upset because the dinner's getting cold, and we would eat as a family. And Rick would join us, and we'd sit and have dinner as a family. And then every night, invariably, it never failed, Dad would go back to work and go back to the lab. And there were some nights, especially in the summer, that we would go to the Duke Faculty Club. There was a swimming pool, and so the three of us were there. And there are many, many nights when Dad, on his way home, would forget us there, to the great discouragement of the manager of the Duke Faculty Club, because there were these three children, just abandoned. The lights are going off in the parking lot, it's pitch black. And we're just there, and we just said, no, it's fine. He's still in the lab. He'll be here eventually, And so this was kind of our life, that the lab came first, and not that we didn't, but we understood, and we were raised with this remarkable work ethic of the importance of that contribution and being in lab and dedicating oneself to work. So work ethic was something that Mark really nailed really well. And Rick has talked about the human aspect, just being a human, and to me, I look at all of you, and as Mark's daughter, I know your personal lives. I know your children, and this is because Dad taught me these things. And so we know you and the epochs of people through the lab personally, and that's because Dad didn't view the postdocs and the students and as factories, but rather human beings and people. And I think bringing that level of humanity to science and a very competitive field is really important. And then he was humble. He didn't like the attention. He would be blushing right now if he knew we were doing this. He very, very humble, and always ready to give the credit to others. And I think that's something that he shared with us, his children. To lift up others. And but if any others have three qualities or adjectives that you might think of that would.
Well, I just want to give you another vignette on the work ethic thing. Just another vignette that I'm sure you'll appreciate. So several of my kids and your family, Kathleen, were the same age, and I have this recollection of I don't know whether it was when when the kids were either in Gittins Junior High or whatever the high school was, Jordan. But anyway, somebody from your family and one of my kids were in school, and there was some kind of performance going on, music or choral or I don't know what, and it was being held in the gym. So, I got dragged by Arna, and I guess Mark got dragged by Pauline on a weeknight, of all things, to go to this performance. I mean, I can assure you we both had other things that we were interested in doing. But okay, we were dutiful fathers. We would go. So I got there, and it was a gym, and you sit on bleacher seats. And, my mind was elsewhere, I'm sure. And then across this was before things started, across the way, Jim, I see Mark and Pauline sitting there. So I said, I'll go over and schmooze with Mark for a minute. So I go over, And here's Pauline. I say hello. Mark's sitting down. He's working on a manuscript. He has a pad, okay, I'm not kidding you, in the gym, waiting for the choral performance to begin. And he was actually editing a manuscript draft. So I remember thinking to myself, geez, I thought I had a work ethic, but this is a whole different level of endeavor and commitment.
You know what he taught me? When I go watch Sophia play volleyball, I edit my manuscripts while I'm watching my daughter play volleyball.
Okay, so you learn that lesson.
But watch yourself when you do that, because I did a lot of editing beside the soccer field for my son. Problem, I cheered for every goal. Eric's goals, Eric's competitor goals. Because I couldn't keep the game straight.
Just maybe something that links the humanity, generosity, and work ethics. Just an anecdote. It was my first author nature paper in Bob's lab. I was supposed to go on a trip for a meeting that Bob didn't want to go, probably, something like that. And the galleys come back. And this is the time when you were correcting galleys directly on the galleys. I mean, there was no such thing as doing that on the computer. Figures to be changed with letter sets and, that kind of, sort of very old kind of doing things. And then I'm all despaired because I need to go. The plane is leaving the next day. The galleys have arrived and, they have to be returned in 48 hours. And I'm like, what are we going to do? And Mark says, don't worry, Michel. I'll take care of that. And so Mark just did the galleys. He was a co-author, but, I was supposed to be the first author, was responsible for this. Just don't worry, it's going to be taken care of. So generosity and at the same time, the work ethic was there. And talking about traveling, if you want another quality, he was a great traveler. He was not worried. Well, he traveled a lot, first of all, but he was not worried about the traveling. And I have few memories, but just one. An overseas flight. We're tired. We're getting in a big city. I don't remember, Copenhagen, Paris, I don't remember. And I'm thinking, let's take a cab, right? To go to, no. Public transportation. Let's take, we're tired. We just want to go to bed. But he knew all the things. He knew the subway. He knew how to get from place to place. So he handled traveling extremely well.
Michel, I don't know if you recall, he carried maps of the major subway systems in cities like Paris and London and God knows where else in his attaché case. So he was always ready. And this was one of many characteristics of Mark that I envied, but could never succeed in emulating. One was his ease as a traveler. I was always a terrible traveler, always caused me great anxiety. That hasn't changed to this very day. Another one was his ability to never seem rushed. I mean, he would give you his time pretty much until you signaled you were done. I mean, he would never cut you short. And I can tell you that continued right up to the end. His office was right down the hall from me. And so at my age, I was heading down to the bathroom multiple times in an afternoon. And each time, back and forth, I'd go by his office. I'd say a couple of times a week for no reason other than just to schmooze. If I saw there was nobody in the office, I would just pop in. And no matter what he was doing, and he was always doing something, he would just turn around and we schmoozed. And when I was done talking, but it was never a time, I can't remember a single time, where he said to me, Bob, I'm busy. Can we take care of this later? Or I've got a deadline. Nothing. I mean, he was always there, always give you his ear. And they talk about these psychological types, type A, type B. I'm the classical type A, driven, always in a rush, very time conscious, competitive. And then there's type B, which is supposedly the opposite of all those things. Mark was an interesting subtype in that he was a hybrid. Okay, he was obviously driven, competitive, a lot of the type A characteristics, but without the negative stuff about always being in a rush and feeling pressured, etc. I mean, that's really the ideal blend. But try as I might, I was never able to emulate that sort of grace under pressure attitude that he had.
He was a biased agonist.
He was indeed, absolutely. That he was. Yeah, that he was.
Yes. Speaking of the traveling, it's true. He traveled a lot, and it was always very surprising to us as children that Dad knew the people at Raleigh-Durham International Airport by first name. He knew all of the travel folks behind the desks, and at the holidays he would bring them gifts. And I once traveled and happened to be at the American Airlines desk, and the woman takes my passport, and I was traveling internationally, and she looks up at me and she goes, "Oh, you're Mark's daughter." Yes. So, like when you know everyone in the airport by first name. Yes, he did travel a lot, but I think he really enjoyed it.
Just an anecdote on that. I remember coming back from a meeting in Italy with Mark, and we were on TWA, I think, and it may have been in Rome, and he was in business class, and I was in economy class, and we checked in together, and he knew the person behind the desk, and he talked her into upgrading me to business class. So we were able to return back from Rome to New York in business class. It was really remarkable. So he really did know everyone on the airlines.
Yeah, I just want to mention, talking about traveling, and it's something related to the trust he had in us. And I have to tell you my personal experience, and that was when Mark and Pauline went to Japan on a long trip. I think it was for a month. He asked my wife and I, "Can you look after the kids?" So
we had a blast.
We had a blast. Exactly. So we stayed in your house, Kathleen, for about a month, and you were a teenager. I don't know how old you were, 14, 15 or something like that, and wanted to take care of your own business. So we saw you once in a while, but we saw Melissa and Nelson a lot. So it worked out really, really well. I think we survived, didn't we?
We did. The kitchen caught on fire. Do you remember?
We did. We set fire to the oil.
Fire to the kitchen. It's okay. No worries.
Yeah, but I mean, that's another part of the. He was such a humanist. He was so kind. He was so in so many ways, and we got to know him beyond science as a true good person.
Another characteristics we haven't mentioned is self-reliance. He was a remarkably self-reliant man. Again, the mirror opposite of myself. I was always surrounded by assistants. And through much of my career, I had 2 full-time assistants. And Mark never had any. He would use a pool of departmental secretaries if he needed help with something like that. But he handled all his own travel arrangements. Now, this did have a downside. I remember on one occasion, I can't remember all the details, where he was going somewhere to give a talk. And I guess he got the date screwed up. He was only off by 1, I think. So he got there and nobody was expecting him. I mean, his seminar was like on Friday, and he shows up on Wednesday. He just had the dates wrong. I can't remember whether he flew home and then went back or whether he just hung out there. But yeah, he pretty much handled all his own travel, amongst many other things.
Thank you for that. Anyone else wants to share 3 top qualities that you think made Mark?
So let me mention one other thing. Unlike everyone else on this call, I'm probably the only one who has was a long-time competitor of Mark, working on dopamine receptors, not only as a graduate student, but then during my entire career at the NIH. And Mark was a great competitor, and it speaks a lot to his heart because unlike the Levitsky style of competition that Lee mentioned earlier, it was always a very friendly competition, one in which we were always willing to help each other out. Mark was willing to send me research materials, clones, antibodies, mice, even though he knew that I was competing against him on various projects. And I think that tells a lot about just what a good man Mark was. And I was honored to, compete against him in the field of dopamine receptors. So I thank him for that.
This attribute of how decent a person Mark was, I'm sure many of you saw the little obit, if you will, that I wrote in, because it was Nature Neuroscience. And in it, I wrote that Mark was perhaps the most decent human being I had ever met. But in the draft that was submitted, I said that he was the ultimate mensch. I'd like to think that everybody on this call, having worked with me, knows what a mensch is, knows that Yiddish word. But the editor took it out. She said that she was concerned with the international readership of Nature journals, that there would be people from a variety of cultures who would not understand the word mensch. I couldn't really argue that point until the term was deleted. But amongst us, I would just say he was the most ultimate mensch that I ever had the privilege to know.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So let's segue a little bit into another question or another prompt, if you will, to tell us about a time when Mark played a key role in your success. And I can't put myself on the spot right now because it's basically my whole life in so many ways, as a mom and just a scientist and a good human being. I hope I try to live up to that example. But Jeff, do you want to kick us off on something?
Sure.
Putting you on the spot?
Yeah, sure.
Or anything else that you're more comfortable with?
No. Well, so when I joined the lab, my project that was given to me was purifying the beta receptor from mammalian systems. And obviously, I ran into a number of problems. Mark was always there. The initial problem was the receptor appeared to be proteolyzed. And actually, the only way that we figured that out was because there were development of photoaffinity ligands for the beta receptor, which allowed us to label the receptor and then run it on gel and see there were multiple bands. And there was kind of this thinking a little bit by other labs that maybe these were different isoforms. And so we met with some of the people in the biochemistry department and really decided that we should try to, that was likely due to proteolysis, inhibit the proteolysis, and ultimately we're able to get it down to one single band from different species. And it was, Mark really played a central role in all of that. And ultimately that allowed us to feed that purified receptor into, Rick's work with reconstitution and into the cloning, which, to get amino acid sequence, then ultimately Brian took over the cloning aspects. So without Mark's really expertise at every step of the way, I don't know that I would ever have been able to successfully purify the receptor. So it was really critical in the early work.
And I guess Brian, you were part of that as well. And how did that transition go?
Well, so I was, as I mentioned, a cloner, not a purifier. But after the cloning was successful, and I remember just trying to figure out what I would do next, what I could contribute. And I was kind of intimidated by the purifiers. Actually, they, what they were doing was much more challenging. And I just remember talking to Mark about, options, and I really was interested in understanding how these proteins work, but I had no, just the thought of trying to become a purifier and actually do structural biology was sort of daunting. And I remember a couple of conversations with Mark where he really encouraged me not to just stay in my comfort zone, and that I needed to, if I really wanted to do something that would, contribute something new to the field, I couldn't just continue to do what I was doing. I would have to learn new techniques. And on several occasions, he really helped me both. Jeff also helped a lot, I should mention, in terms of training me in biochemistry. But I wasn't always comfortable going to Jeff with really stupid questions. And Mark was always there. He'd never make me feel, and Jeff didn't either, but I just felt somehow more comfortable with really, I would say, naive questions about biochemistry. Anyway, when I left the lab, I was fairly competent in biochemistry, and I think he really helped me, in that new career trajectory that took me to structural biology.
I would just underscore that, because I remember very vividly, Brian, just what you were saying, that, up until a certain point, deep into your time at Duke, you really had relatively little exposure to the biochemical aspects of the projects. And of course, your big success came with the cloning. And then for a year or two after that, everybody had you pegged as the cloner, so that everybody wanted your help, whether it was Susanna with the alpha ones, et cetera, et cetera. But then my recollection is that, as you prepared to sort of set up your own shop at Duke and then move on to Stanford, you made a concerted effort to learn from Mark and also Jeff all the nuances of receptor purification and biochemistry. And yeah, that was really crucial for your later success, because you would take the techniques that we had developed in our group for purifying micrograms and then hundreds of micrograms. And then if we worked diligently for a month or so, a milligram of receptor, none of which would have been sufficient for your purposes. And by meticulously deconstructing the procedures, how the affinity chromatography column was made, how it was eluted, many different steps along the way, you were able to scale that up to the 10 milligram stage. And that was what was, at least in my understanding, one of the real keys to your ultimate success in the structural biology arena. But I think that was made possible by what you learned from Mark about the essentials of receptor biochemistry.
Rick, I know you have to leave very soon. I'm going to put you on the spot and maybe ask you about a time where Mark played a key role in your success. Well, other than the broccoli story, or in addition to the broccoli story.
Right, well, the broccoli story was important, though, to my success, because I did ultimately learn how to eat vegetables at some point. One of the things is that he was sort of overseeing, as people have said, the biochemistry. It was in 310, I think it was the Sands building, and it was me and Jeff, and Mark was right across the hall. And, one thing that it was a camaraderie, and it was fun. And, I started to appreciate that, having a lab should be fun. You should have, not only should you have success, but you should have fun. And it was really a fun time. But before I leave, I just want to talk about this one story that gets to Mark knowing everybody and everything. And, when I first got there, they were purifying receptors from red blood cells from frogs. And we used to have this assembly line that was really grotesque. You'd get 500 to 1,000 frogs from Mexico. And Mark was like an expert pither. So you would pith the frog so the frog would be done, and then someone would open it up, and then they drain the blood, and then you start isolating the red blood cells. And so Mark tried to show me how to do each step, and of course I failed miserably. I couldn't pith. The frog would hop away, and so finally he said, "Okay, what Rocco will do is drive the truck." And so what that meant is that they get all the carcasses, put it on this thing, and I take it to the basement where they were getting rid of carcasses. But the problem arose when they would come. Sometimes these frogs would come in on a late Friday afternoon, and nobody wanted to do this operation on late Friday or come in Saturday morning to start massacring frogs. So you had to keep them at least somewhat alive. And so again, I was single, I didn't have a family, so I would have to go to the basement of Sands on Saturday afternoon and water the frogs. They would be in these pizza boxes with holes, and I'd be sitting there watering frogs, And I'm thinking, here I go, I came to this lab, I wanted to do great things, and I'm postdoc watering frogs on a Saturday afternoon and half the time the air conditioning would go out and be hot as hell. So I remember telling Mark, I can't do this anymore. I just can't water frogs. So Mark goes, okay. Somehow he knows the people who are sending the frogs from Mexico, and he gets them to make sure they don't come on late Friday afternoon. So I have to water frogs on Saturday night. So, aside from all the biochemistry that he knew, and he was a great scientist, we talked about what a great heart he had. He also was really, resourceful and traveling and dealing with the frog people. So I just want to say, because I do have to leave, I want to thank you, Yamina and Kathleen, for including me. It's great seeing all of you. If you get bored where you are, it's sunny Ithaca. You'd always be welcome here, and otherwise, have a happy holiday.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Rick.
As he's logging off, one of my fondest memories as a child on Saturday was to go into the lab, and before the frog was pithed, I would get to play with it. And so we would race them down the hall. Bob, I don't know if you remember, but we would have the frogs racing down the hall.
Yes, I do remember that. Very vividly.
We would play with them because why not? It's Saturday afternoon and we're in the lab.
Absolutely. To try to preserve the health of the frogs for at least the few days that they were there, we looked into, what do frogs eat? And my recollection is there was no internet to look up stuff, but somehow we got it in our heads that frogs eat crickets. So then we started ordering large quantities of crickets to feed to the frogs. Then the question came up, how do we keep the crickets going? What do the crickets eat? But I don't remember how we solved that one.
Yeah. I only remember the frogs coming in and stanking in the mailroom. So the mailroom would call and say, well, we got some frogs who are stanking over here.
Then we would dispatch somebody to pick up the boxes, 2,000 frogs.
Lee, I really want to hear about that 2 a.m. cold room conversation. Or story.
Well, so many a night first of all, you all know that Mark was bilingual, right? It's so hard to talk about him in the past tense, by the way. So I'm having trouble with that as we talk. So, and he had this error notion, just like Brian Kabilka doesn't think he's very hands-on competent in the lab or likes to think that was once true. Mark used to think that English was something he couldn't read well, speak well, or understand well, which naturally was nonsense. But he also did have an occasional misuse of a word because of that bilinguality. So we were one night working in the lab, and I'm sure it was 2, because that's just when things happened in the lab. And so we're in there, we're working side by side, and he's saying, I'm glad I'm inert, because I spend more time with you than I spend with Pauline. So you know what he meant by inert, okay? So that aside, then we realize that the cold room is no longer cold, and it's broken. So before it occurs to us to go and borrow, without his permission in the middle of the night, Pat McKee's cold room next to ours. We decide we know how to make a cold. This is when resourceful goes wrong. So we go get styrofoam boxes full of dry ice from down the hall. And I guess we forgot the CO2 part of dry ice. So about 10 minutes in, we're looking at each other thinking, we do not feel good. We really do not feel good. So inert Mark and I then took our columns and moved them next door to Pat McKee's office. But Mark was just fun. Just fun.
Lee, I believe my recollection is one of Mark's malapropisms, if I can use that term, or mispronunciations that you used to have a lot of fun with. One time he said something could be divided into a third, a third.
Oh,
and a third.
yeah. So
How did that come out?
Yeah. So Pauline made him wonderful lunches, and Andre de Leon was a cook as well, and he made wonderful lunches. And I was married to a surgical resident. So I was married to a grumpy vegetable who was home about 3 hours a week. So I didn't have wonderful lunches. So Mark was always willing to share a turd with me. And when I left, I made him a little stamp, which of course he did not appreciate, but I think he understood I was trying to be funny, not hurtful, which was a turd, TIRD, no H, by any other name.
But the point is that H's are difficult for French Canadian. We all have this little difficulty with this letter. Maybe to come back to the influence that Mark had in our career, or mentors are important for many reasons, and each of us had a few mentors, and definitely Mark was one of my mentors. And one of the things that I do, I'm sure most of us do, is thinking when we have a situation, what would Mark do? And that's one way by which Mark was extremely important for me, because in particular, when I had a postdoc where a student was spinning his wheels, right? Clearly, it's not working for some reason. And Mark, being what we said before, trying to always to find the good side into the people, I was thinking, what would Mark do with a guy like this, which, nothing is happening? And I was thinking, well, maybe it's because it's the wrong project. And I know Mark would think that way, would say, oh my God, maybe it's the wrong project for this person. And if we would switch the question, maybe he could address it. And I must admit, I tried that a few times. And it worked some of the times, not always, but it worked some of the time. So yeah, the influence that Mark had just in thinking, what would he do in such a circumstances, was certainly for me a very important aspect of how I was able to succeed in whatever I succeeded.
Thank you for that. Anyone else wants to add anything? I think it's a great segue, Michelle, to the last but not least question we have here. What should junior scientists know about Mark, in your opinion? And we can go around the room. Kathleen, I'm gonna put the spotlight on you, and let's start with you, and we can go from there.
Yeah. What should junior scientists know about Mark? Well, so many things. You have to love science. You have to love it with, every bone in your body. And it's a love affair of, seeking and that quest for the truth and for, new techniques and always being on the cutting edge. And you just have to be inspired by that and wake up every morning excited for that next challenge. And that's how you keep yourself young, and it's how you keep yourself enthusiastic, because it's hard. And, we've talked about all the successes, but my goodness, how many failures, right? I mean, how many failures? And so it's having that effusive enthusiasm that it has to be at your core. And though I think, Dad was good at identifying those people who have that passion, and who just have that love for science. And so I think that's an important lesson for junior scientists. You have to love what you're doing every single day, even when it's hard, right? And even when it's failing, you have to love that process. So.
Of course, this is where the mentoring thing comes in. So what Kathleen describes is experiencing one's work as a calling. That is a sense that you were really destined to do whatever it is you're doing. It doesn't have to be something grand. And we tend to associate the concept of a calling or a vocation with clergy, but you could do anything could be a calling if you really feel it. But most people never have that experience. Now, everybody here on this call has had that experience throughout their life. But where did that come from? Well, probably the single most important thing in experiencing a calling for most of us was having a or several role models who modeled that for us. And you just say, wow, what a way to live. I mean, not to feel that you're working for a living, but sort of like an artist, you're just doing what you do. I mean, that you do it not to earn a living, although that's sort of a side product, but I mean, you do it because that's just what you do. And you do it with passion because you love it. Well, yeah, but most people don't have that. And even people who have careers as opposed to jobs, most of them still don't have that sense. So what that sense comes from is one or more mentors who model it. And nobody did that better or more effectively or more authentically than Mark.
Yeah, let me speak to that as well. So, I mean, I think what junior investigators can learn from Mark is how to be a good mentor. And it's not just, well, someone is in the lab. So, yeah, that's somewhat the easy part. So he was the person you could go to. He would give you guidance. If your project wasn't working, he would help sort it out, or you might even think about changing your project. But it's really, when you're someone's mentor, it's really for life. And I think Mark has been someone who's, at least for me, has always been there when I've needed his help over the years. Sometimes we've collaborated on projects. Sometimes we've been competing on projects, but he was always there for me, and I really value that. And I think junior investigators should really model themselves after that. They're just starting out. They're just training people in their lab, but really to take that to heart. That's you're helping to guide that individual for the rest of their life, and really buy into that.
Frederick?
Yeah, no, Bob, you bring up a good thing, calling, and that's something that I've learned to always tell PhD students that come in and want to do work in my lab, and this calling. It has to be so deep within you in order for you to survive in academic science. And another aspect also that I've gotten from Mark is to dare to jump into the deep end of the pool, to dare to do the difficult things. And I remember after having been in Mark's and your lab, Bob, for 3.5 or 4 years, I was considering, well, maybe I should just stay here, and I think, Bob, you said, yeah, you can stay for a while longer, and Mark told me Mark told me that you have to think about your academic career. You need to go on. You need to jump in the deep end of the pool. You go on, and in order to build your own group and continue, and that is what will satisfy your needs in the long run. So at least for me, this mentoring was. We talked a lot about it and how to proceed. Because being in this group, Mark's and your group, it was great. It was very stimulating. It was a lot of things. That's where everything happened. But you got to go on and build your own path. And Mark helped me realize that.
Lee, did you have your hand up?
So one of the things for junior investigators that Mark emulated so well, and you've all referred to it in different ways, is this whole business of joy. That the passion and the fact that you can't stop thinking about experiments and designing experiments, there's a joy to that. And I think one of the challenges in all these professional development programs these days are emphasizing things like working hard and being willing to be in the lab 7 days a week and da-da-da. But all those things happen because first there's joy there. And I think part of Mark's joy that he passed on was in part because of his humility. He was so willing to be silly, so you could be silly together. You know, we'd have moon landings with the gamma counters and put it by the little battery on the side to make still it was, and we'd imitate moon landings in the lab 2, 3 in the morning, just to sort of, we weren't complaining we were there. If we were going to be there, this could also be fun. And I hope Brian forgives me for this, but I think Brian caught a bit of that that joyfulness, because once when Brian and I were later collaborating, I called him and he was late to the phone. Why? Because his lab was having a practice celebration. Do you remember that? Because his project was so long-term, Brian was smart enough to not wait until the end, right? But do some practice celebrations in between. And I just thought that was brilliant. So, you know, it got passed down through the generations.
Yeah, we call it pre-celebrating.
Oh, excuse me.
Brian, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about how did the pre-celebration tradition came to be in your lab?
I'm not really sure. Honestly, I think it was partly my wife's idea. But I remember during the cloning, we talk about failures. I mean, the cloning was about 1.5 years of failures. And I think we actually started it in the Lefkowitz lab with little pre-celebrations because everybody was so depressed. We would get hits, on our screens, and we'd work them up, and they turned out to be nothing. Yeah, so that's all I can really remember. It might have dated back to the Lefkowitz years. And I would often say that during those bleak times, when we were failing, we would frequently get visits from both Bob and Mark, and I don't know whether they did it as a tag team, but they sensed the mood was not so good. They would come in and sort of shoot the breeze and try to help us troubleshoot, and then we felt a little better. Maybe next time we'll get it.
Yeah, keeping spirits up is something you really need to do in the laboratory, because, as we all say, it's mostly failure most of the time. So an optimistic spirit is certainly, and Mark was great at that, or at least transmitting it. You don't have to feel optimistic in your heart to act optimistic to your trainees. We all know that. But that's very important. And Mark was very good about that.
Continuing on the theme of joy. Yeah, continuing on the theme of joy. It's not because it's hard, it cannot be fun. But the one thing, I'm not a jealous person at all, ever. But once I experienced a little bit of jealousy. And this was when, the Galley story again, but the Galleys came back for the nature cloning of the beta-2 receptor. And here they were, Mark Bob, and Brian, and maybe there was somebody else, but at least the three of them were in Bob's office with scissors and cutting pieces of the galleys from the Nature paper and pasting things that they had printed out on some other piece of papers, trying to get the galleys out within, I don't know, 12 hours, whatever ridiculous time frame that they had. So on the one hand, it looked like it was ridiculous, right? These grown up, cutting paper pieces and sticking them onto each other. But then they were having a lot of fun, and I felt, I was just across in the lab, just across Bob's office, and they were laughing and they were cutting and they were stitching things. And I thought, I'm missing on something, something is happening in this office, and clearly there was a lot of joy involved in this. Clearly,
another story, very much of the same piece, but relates to the same tale, was when the cloning was finally successful. So we were coming down the stretch. We were in this big race. We didn't know when this other group, it was it was the single most intense competition I ever remember in my career. And we were competing with the group at Genentech, which were the world's experts in cloning. We had no experience. And so we were collaborating with the group at Merck, and Brian was leading the effort here at Duke. And as I recall, it came down to the fact, both groups were working on the sequencing of genomic clones, which were intronless, as it turned out, and which would have the whole open reading frame that we needed. And we were sort of coming from two different ends, and we kind of reached an impasse where there was a region of, Brian would remember better, of so many base pairs that they just couldn't get at Merck, and so we couldn't complete the sequence. And then Brian had some crazy ideas about using ungodly amounts of radioactivity, or I don't remember what. But so he worked on it. And I remember I went home for dinner, and he was going to read the whether or not he was able to connect up. And then he called me to say, yeah, we got it. We got the whole thing now. So I immediately said, okay, I'm coming in. I came in, Mark came in, and Brian was there. And there was a main collaborator at Merck named Seagal, Richards. Was it Richard Seagal?
Green.
Irving Seagal, right, who tragically died in the Pan Am bombing not that many years after. So here we were, a group of us in my office, and it was in the evening, I'll say 9 o'clock. So we called Merck to try to tell Irving Seagal. Of course, he wasn't there. In fact, the only person who was there was like a night watchman. And I said, can you give me Seagal's phone number, so we can call him home? He said, I'm not permitted to give that out. I said, well, could you call Irving Seagal, tell him that Bob Lefkowitz is calling, we have important news. And then the four of us sat there, all at Twitter waiting, and sure enough, Seagal called, and with great drama and excitement and celebration, we told him. But yeah, that was the kind of thing. I mean, that camaraderie, that spirit that we all shared, and just sort of appreciating that moment for what it was.
Well, great discoveries and great teamwork. So I think we're coming to a close, and I just want to say personally, on and on behalf of Melissa and Nelson, thank you all for being here and for contributing. It's just so joyful to see everyone and have these wonderful recollections and of what an amazing person Dad was. So thank you so much. And I also want to give a huge thanks to Yamina for her innovation and her leadership in assembling this and assembling this wonderful group of people together. She's done amazing things with Dr. GPCR. I hope that you all subscribe and participate in that community. It's wonderful for the field. And so Yamina, thank you for bringing us together, and thank you to all of you for your sharing joy and happiness and fond remembrances.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And while you were all talking about the stories, the 2 a.m. cold room. I remember it just took me back to the times when I was working in the lab. And I really enjoyed that time. And it was difficult. It was hard. We went from dopamine rush to dopamine rush. And the time between the two dopamine rushes was undetermined, sometimes years in between. And thank you, everyone, for sharing all your stories, for taking the time. Kathleen, wonderful to have you on. Thank you for helping with this project. You've been an amazing co-host. I cannot wait to do the other 3 podcast episodes. So this is 100. We have 2 other decades to visit, and then Kathleen and I are going to be taking some time and talk in a separate episode. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Any last thoughts? Now is the time. We're going to stop recording in a second. I would like you to stay on until we stop recording so I can say thank you to you again offline. With this, thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you for joining us and listening to the 100th episode of the Dr. GPCR podcast. We would like to thank our guests, my co-host, Dr. Kathleen Caron, and our Dr. GPCR team members, Atela Forrest, Ines Pinero, and Montserrat Avila Zuzoya. A huge thank you to our ecosystem partners as well for their support: Domain Therapeutics, GPCR Therapeutics, Design Pharmaceuticals, Montana Molecular, and Orion Biotechnology. You can connect with our partners directly in the ecosystem. Join us at drgpcr.com/ecosystem. Please subscribe to the Dr. GPCR newsletter. Find us on YouTube. And if you like our podcast, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. You can also leave us a testimonial at drgpcr.com/testimonials. Another great way to support us is to share your favorite Dr. GPCR program with your network and colleagues. As always, you can email us with any questions or suggestions at hello@drgpcr.com. Until next time, stay safe.